I would like to invite now to the stage Thomas Liu, who is going to lead a moderated Q&A session with the audience and Administrator Power. As he comes up here, let me tell you a little bit about Thomas. Thomas graduated last weekend from the College of William and Mary. Come on up. With a double major in government and business analytics. While he was on campus, he was the president of the William and Mary Global Innovation Challenge, which is a student-led organization that promoted interdisciplinary collaboration and applied learning. He, for the last 3 years, has been a consultant to SID and has been indispensable in our delivery of virtual programming around the country and around the world. We wouldn't have been able to do things without him, especially the last 3 conferences. He is passionate about development, and he has just accepted a job with Accenture. So I'm happy to turn the floor over to Thomas. I will say the administrator only has, I think, about 15 or so minutes left, 15 or 20 minutes. We will take questions. If you can plan to line up at the mics, we probably only have time for questions, 3 or 4 questions. And then I would also say to the virtual audience, we are running a few minutes late. All the virtual sessions will start as soon as this session is over, so stand by for those. Thomas.
Thank you, Wade, for the kind introduction. And as someone who has worked behind the scenes for the past 3 virtual conferences, it's really great to be back in person. And as a first-generation immigrant, and most importantly, an aspiring development practitioner, I'm beyond flattered for Wade, Bobby, Catherine, and the entire SID Washington team for providing me this opportunity to have the conversation with Administrator Power. Only 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity right before my college graduation, actually, to present at the USAID Higher Education Global Education Summit. And we talked about our session, focusing on creating more broader approaches for youth-led voices to be included in international development. So 2 weeks after, here I am with you. It's, again, such a great honor. Madam Administrator, we are so delighted to have you here at this hybrid conference, and we actually have more than 500 people watching online through the TechChange virtual platform. And thank you for sharing your vision to our audience. And I was inspired by your remarks focusing on building relationships across the globe. And so to kick off this moderated conversation, I'll ask Administrator Power the first question, and then we'll open it up to 2 or 3 questions from the in-person audience, and we have 1 last question reserved for the virtual audiences. And folks are lined up already in the middle, and we'll just go down the queue. And here is the question. Administrator Power, you just gave a speech focusing on progress and not programs. The world is currently embroiled in the massive crisis in Ukraine. And what is happening there is tragic. But we're also seeing our allies united more than ever before. And Congress is poised to commit an unprecedented amount of funding for its response. So if there was a moment when we can implement aid differently, now seems to be the time. And so how can we do things differently as it evolves? And what do you think how we can seize this moment? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, so glad we're getting to put the youth voice inclusion, agenda into full practice already, and so glad you're entering this field, and we certainly need you and welcome you. So I'd say a few things. One, I don't think any of us can take for granted the unbelievable show of bipartisanship and unity that the Ukraine crisis has generated so far. It's really a beautiful thing. I have had to do 4 defenses of our budget request before the appropriations and the authorizing committees. And while, of course, there's not full unity across the board, there's no question that Ukraine has brought people together. But that really can wear off over time, and no one's more aware of that, I'm sure, than all of you. But that gets to the point I made in the speech about and your question, how do we take a moment like this to where people are seized with it, and, even in our own communities here in the United States, as refugees arrive or as Ukrainian Americans have stories to tell, to keep this salient to people. And I think one part of the answer is also telling a story of the impact that we are making with the resources already expended. But that, again, as interest fades and as other horrific events unfold, as they have this week, attention gets drawn elsewhere. So we have to keep an eye on that. All of us, I think, all of us have an important role. And for those of you who are working in Ukraine, just the communications aspect of what we do is so very important, as is telling a story about burden sharing. And that's also something, oddly, that we don't do as naturally as we might. So, for example, to be in a position to say the United States has invested this amount, for example, in direct budget support for the Ukrainian government so that they can keep pensioners fed and they can keep social services running. And in so doing, we've also managed to attract these new donors into this direct budget support relationship. And the European Union, which is spending X amount on the European Union side of the Ukrainian border, now also is coming inside Ukraine and doing the following. So communicate the impact and the good that the work that you're doing is the impact it's having on real lives inside Ukraine, but also lift up the degree to which we are not alone. So we kind of like to be alone and leading, but we also, I think, to sustain support, need to show that we are leveraging our resources to get more back. I think beyond that, and I know we have a lot of questions, so I'll wrap up here, but I think it's really important to look at Ukraine, as horrific as it all has been, as an opportunity with such developed institutions to do things a little bit differently. So, for example, right now, there are a number of different actors who are providing multi-purpose cash assistance to the Ukrainian people. UNICEF is doing it. I think IOM is now doing it. UNHCR is definitely doing it, and WFP is doing it probably in greater numbers than anybody else. But so too is the Ukrainian Ministry for Social Protection. Well, surely whatever the multi-purpose cash assistance plan that congeals here as front lines move, but where there's not as much volatility in the front lines as there was in the early days of the war, surely that should be a Ukrainian-led, or at the very least co-designed plan for how people in need receive cash so that markets could get up and running. And so not only are our development people thinking about the work that they are doing with various ministries with development objectives in mind, alongside the reconstruction conversation that is, of course, already starting, but our humanitarian team, led by Sarah Charles, is also thinking through, how, when we have $4.3 billion granted in the second supplemental for humanitarian assistance for both Ukrainians and people affected by the war in Ukraine, what is the right allocation of those resources, and how, consistent with the need to prevent fraud, waste, corruption, abuse, et cetera, can we imagine the provision of even humanitarian assistance with an eye to the longer-term development of Ukraine. And I don't want to pretend that it's easy, because again, the vetting and the due diligence that one has to do in order to develop a partnership. But I think we're thinking in the humanitarian realm now about consortia, where you might have an international NGO leading a consortia of local NGOs, but with an eye again to those local partners, in the long term, being capable of receiving those grants or those contracts as well. I shouldn't say in the long term, in the medium term. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I think we can do 2 to 3 questions. And the first one in front of the mic, please be brief, and we're mindful of time. And please identify yourself and your affiliated organization. Thank you.
Hello. Is this on? Hello? Hello? Jeffrey Marburg Goodman, back with USAID for the 3rd time. I'm your legal advisor for, as you know, for Haiti on an interim basis. I shuttle back and forth. I'll be back there in a couple of weeks if security permits. This is not a planted question, as you will see. We really, I think the whole community appreciates your support for Haiti. I know the mission does, and your words at the Senate subcommittee yesterday, the hearing, and that appreciation was shared by the senators. At that hearing, you said something really intriguing and important about mentoring and building capacity of local organizations, and I think probably small businesses and innovators everywhere. You talked about the OE Plus Up. You were thankful for that, and the strong hiring of foreign service officers, including COs, never enough COs, including as a front-end way, you said, of reaching the back end or the later end of capacitating organizations that are new to USAID. And I guess my question is, I'm wondering whether you and your team have fleshed out a methodology or actual structures for providing that capacity development, for having the contracting officers, controllers, governance personnel, and together with large organizations that know how to do the compliance, to actually impart and transfer those skills. I think that's a very hard task, and I know there are a lot of ideas percolating in the development community about just how to do that. I don't expect you to be able to get into any great detail about that, but it's where the rubber hits the road in terms of capacitating and mentoring new organizations.
Thank you. I'm going to be super brief because I would be sad if everybody who's standing in line didn't get to be heard, even if I didn't get to do great justice to all of the questions. And also, since you work at USAID, we should talk elsewhere. But it reminds me that probably it's worth doing a town hall or something, internal to the organization, beyond the kinds of conversations we've had about this already. So I'd say a couple of things. I mean, first, when it comes to beefing up the contractor presence at headquarters and at missions, I mean, it's just an urgent priority that our contracting officers are thoroughly overwhelmed as it is, even without something that would require more small contracts, more small grants, and thus place more person-hour burdens on them. I do think, with COVID-19, one of the things I gather that happened, and you may know well from Haiti, at missions around the world, is that our incredible Foreign Service nationals often stepped in to perform contracting roles. And so thinking through, how some of those authorities that occurred in light of the crisis, how those authorities can be retained. That's part also of our Foreign Service National Empowerment Agenda, which is a whole nother speech and another dialogue, which is so critical to USAID's work around the world. So getting more of those officers is important. There's a community of practice for locally led development that we have built within USAID. The great Don Steinberg has come out of retirement and is working with PPL, with Adam Phillips as well, to in a sense, get a set of guidelines and direction to the various missions. But it's interesting, in convening mission directors, as we have many times, to get their ideas about how best to position them, because you heard me in my speech saying I want to get our people out of offices and away from reporting requirements, and yet, the locally led development agenda can actually produce more paperwork burdens and more demands on staff that keep them office bound, which would be a perverse outcome indeed. But the variation among missions, those that have used local works or NPI in order to already, move that agenda forward, those that are very, very vigilant when an organization is a sub to make sure that the prime is actually doing that kind of institutional capacity building during the life of a grant or a sub. And so some of it is really genuinely about just standardizing or making sure that every mission is able to access again, in the community of practice, the best practices that are being observed. But we need more operational expenses as well. And while in some countries there are actual organizations that themselves build capacity of fellow local organizations, some of you may have worked in countries where that is the case, that's pretty rare. So we are expecting that kind of left seat, right seat, mentorship and partnership relationship with local organizations is going to ask a lot of our staff, and that is one reason among several that we are, of course, each year continuing to try to grow our foreign service, our civil service, at the agency. And there seems to be significant support on the Hill for that, just as there is for the idea of development that seems more likely to leave something lasting behind us. And so, again, those additional resources will be necessary and very, very helpful to take this agenda forward.
The second question, please.
Yes, my name is Chris O'Donnell. I'm the head of Development Essentials. I'm an Air Force Academy graduate, 20 years in the military, and then my second career was USAID, Foreign Service Contracting Officer, and that's the subject of my question. First, I want to thank you for your testimony last July saying COs are carrying a $65 million load versus DOD at 15. It kind of makes DOD look like Club Med. After your testimony, I wrote House Appropriators, Senate Appropriators, and the budget jumped up from $150 million to $258 for the Senate, and the House, which had already passed their budget, changed their mind and said, we'll jump it from $70 million to $258. So we've been watching closely USAID's progress from the outside on the money and other steps with the acquisitions and assistance workforce. So what we've found is 235 advertisements, only 4 for COs. I mean, that's not parity. I think it made it actually worse when you have that many designers and only 4 COs coming on board. OIG report, lots of pressure on COs. Also, GAO report, no workforce standard. And then Mark Green tried to pump up 30%, but then lost 30% during the hiring freeze. And then Ukraine. Jim Hope says, I need 125 COs to move the money after the first supplement. So it'd be helpful to have, what steps have you taken? 4 months left in the year, 80% of the money hasn't been obligated yet of the OE. What's the plan?
That's a great question. All I can say is, again, we operate in an ecosystem where it is extremely challenging, particularly now, to recruit and to hire. I do think that you will start to see those numbers change over time. I don't think, we go through our F process with the State Department and so forth, which itself just eats into the calendar, having certainty around what we have, and then attracting people to USAID to do this work is something we clearly need to do a better job at doing. But I appreciate your engagement in sort of getting those numbers increased. And all I can say is that there's almost nothing that I talked about in my remarks that can happen unless and until we're able to address this issue that you have rightly highlighted and illustrated. How much further we have to go.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your push. Thank you.
Here at SID, we love to have our USAID colleagues join us in industry, so it's great to have so many questions from USAID. And our last question here is from Stephen Murray.
Could we just, I will answer this gentleman's question, but it'd be great to hear, since everybody has stood up, we could just hear everybody, and then I
So should we just roll through?
Yeah, just
Awesome.
roll through all of them
Cool.
if you don't mind. Thank you.
Stephen, you want to go?
Thank you, Mr. Power. Thank you for your inspiring remarks. My name is Stephen Murray. I'm from Cross Boundary and a board member of SID-US. I suspect had Wade or other administrators tried to dissuade you from taking this job, such as your commitment to international development, that it would not have deterred you. You mentioned many of the multitude of problems the world is facing, and big problems need bigger toolkits. And many of those problems are new problems that need new skills and solutions. And I wonder if you could maybe speak about how the thousands of USAID professionals and the broader international development community can really meet those needs, and what are the skills and solutions that you think are most critical as we move forward? Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good morning. Ellie Priadl with International Development Group, or IDG. Thank you for your remarks, Administrator Power. I noted when you were talking about the budget request, you mentioned several areas: humanitarian assistance, climate change, gender, and health. But I noted that economic growth was not included. And given the importance of economic growth for poverty alleviation and economic development, and in particular with the situation in Ukraine and the importance of stabilizing the Ukrainian economy, I'm wondering if you could speak to USAID's priorities, what your vision is for economic growth in USAID going forward. Thank you.
Good morning. Carlos Hasbun from Heifer International. Madam Ambassador, it's really great the push between progress and programs. I think that's a great initiative and strategy in order to build bottoms-up approaches to drive enabling environments in the countries that we work in. My question is related to how the process of integrating diplomacy and development is in the countries, in the missions where USAID operates. Thank you.
Hello, Samantha. Hello, audience. My name is Vlad Jorgonov. I'm Ukrainian. I came from Ukraine, and here I represent Nova Ukraine. It's a charity organization in the US that help Ukrainians. Thank you so much for all your help, guys. Thank you for gathering here. And as you, Samantha, mentioned, now people in Ukraine, those who are socially vulnerable, have food. Thank you so much for providing this help. And we have like two big issues in country. First is food among those people who used to work, who older than 18 years age and younger than 60, who did have a job, who live and build our economy. Now a huge chunk of them, like 40%, were moved from another cities inside of the country. A lot of women with kids moved to outside of the country, but those who currently in Ukraine, those who never ask for help, currently need this help. Among those, we have issues with food, with no understanding how to make money. They do not have jobs. And I maybe would like to hear your advice, because we as a charity organization work with hundreds of volunteering groups who provide this help to those who really need help. But we do not provide any help, and we start running a couple of projects to help those who used to work and don't have work. But maybe you have some advice for Ukrainians, for people who work with Ukraine, how to support those people who older than 18 years, who younger than 60 years, and who is not used to ask for help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as you know, our hearts are with you and your people. Let me try to combine, if I could, a number of the questions together in closing. So first, on the skill set. I mean, this is not a new set of skills. This is a set of skills that all of us would have benefited, I think, from having over the years. But I can just tell you it's a burning need right now, which is we have to communicate the impact of our work in an optimally compelling way. And you know why that's so obvious. Of course, like we have the glossy brochures and all the numerators and the denominators and of who we're impacting, but we're in I find as a relative newcomer to some of these conversations, you know, that sometimes the language it's almost so high level, or it can be very jargony, but it's language that works within the community but doesn't translate as well often outside of it. And you know, I tried with my Apple story, you know, to kind of just give you, you know, a few different examples of what we did here, there, or everything. I mean, those kinds of things that I just described, you all are doing every day, right? And yet, it's something in the translation, you know, renders it just a little loftier than the kind of real world human, and then so-and-so did this, and then this happened, you know, so I mean, we're struggling with it. I struggle with it every day as somebody who tries to communicate, but as a former journalist, I'm always thinking to myself, if I were a journalist, would I understand what that meant concretely? Or when I talk to my mother, you know, I have to bring it home. I got to bring it down to language, a story that she can understand. So I think there's no amount of investment in that, and that means, I think, bringing people from outside this world to kind of interrogate, because it's all lies within those of you who are doing the programming or seeking the progress or hustling in the ways that I've described, but often it just isn't being translated. The second aspect of communication is disinformation, and both programming around disinformation, there's that, but also just a lot of us, our whole world getting maligned, really, and being really kind of still surprised. And, you know, we've gone through this in places like Ethiopia, where USAID is accused of doing things, and it's very hard to know, you know, in the face of such dishonesty, you know, do you come out and name the dishonesty and go meta on the thing? Do you kind of let it go because you're afraid of giving it oxygen? There's like no toolkit here. And so we need people who are seasoned and really understand how to fight disinformation to be part of our enterprise. But the reason I'm able to tie, I think, a few of the questions together is, I think of all the skills, given the core predicate to the remarks I just offered, is skills that will allow bridging to the private sector and specifically to the international financial institutions. And, you know, our folks, and, you know, again, that's not the only skill set. All of the traditional skills are still valuable for sure. But if we are to broaden the pool of resources, if we are to do what we are here to do, which is to work ourselves out of jobs, to spur trade, using catalytic aid, but not expecting aid to be a full part of the picture. If we are to be able to bring blended finance to bear, we need people who come from those other worlds to be part of our world, I think, or people who develop the skills, you know, as a young person like Thomas, and who know how to cross between and among these different communities of practice. And you know, this will be true, for example, as we think about Ukrainian reconstruction. And you know, USAID will be catalytic, I'm sure, in really, really important ways, but it'll be the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank and others who are bringing those resources. Well, so, you know, what is the development world's relationship to that whole initiative? I talked about Maya Sandu, this amazing leader of Moldova. I didn't get into her energy, the sort of energy blackmail that President Putin is subjecting Moldova to. Well, our folks are very involved in the energy sector, but also for our folks to be able to be bridging and pulling in the big financiers that can actually help a country, you know, with what sometimes amounts to bricks and mortar, you know, kind of pipeline construction, and sometimes involves policy choices. It's not that we would do it. It's that talking that language, particularly in the energy and climate space, is going to amount to a larger and larger share, I think, of what development ends up requiring. And it's a part of the answer, not for Ukraine right now, about where new jobs are going to come from, and where economic growth is going to, in part at least, be catalyzed by. And to the question, or the sort of suggestion that I omitted economic growth, I think my whole speech was actually about the need to spur, you know, private sector investment and to get exports to market and so forth. So that's a huge part of our agenda. I do think there are many reasons to be just heartbroken by the fact that there are now 100 million displaced people in the world, more conflict than at any time since the Cold War. There are many reasons that, you know, more wars layering on to prior wars, wars not ending. climate shocks. There's so many reasons to be heartbroken by all of that on the merits. But an additional reason is as our humanitarian budgets necessarily grow to meet these emergency needs, we are not seeing the kind of allocations that I would like to see for investments in our economic growth programming. And so again, we can say, oh, we're just growing our generosity in the humanitarian space, but inevitably, because there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for big increases in the top lines, everything is seen kind of as a piece. But it is where I think USAID has and many of you have such a comparative advantage. It is where countries most want to go. It is where young people, like the young Ukrainian we heard from, most want to hear about, is where are our economic opportunities, not where do we go for humanitarian assistance, right? That is what they are looking for. But that is, again, why the toolkit has to be expanded beyond our traditional budgets, and we have to view what we can give as sometimes an incentive, a loan guarantee, or something to bring others to the table who can bring more meaningful resources to bear, or more significant resources to bear, I should say. Anyway, thank you all so much. Really appreciate the collaboration and the partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Administrator Power.